All right, and welcome back to another episode of Creedal. I am joined today for the first time in a while. We missed our regularly scheduled meeting a couple weeks ago, but joined by my friend Larry Chapp. We're going to break down a great book today. But first, Larry, welcome back to the show. I've missed you.
Well, thank you so much for having me back. I missed you too. I mean, just so your viewers know, I had COVID, and I survived. For me, it was actually very mild, which was like a bad cold for me that lasted about a long bad cold, like 10 days worth of bad cold and a lot of fatigue. But I was one of the lucky ones. So Here I am, completely 100% recovered and happy to be back on your show.
That's great. I'm so glad that you're recovered. I obviously was praying for you when you told me that you had COVID. When you said that you had COVID but you recovered, I was thinking that it's a good thing you didn't say you beat COVID, because there's something wrong with our terminology around illness in the modern world. And I don't know if you've thought about this before. I think about this a lot, especially because my mom passed away from cancer last summer. Last summer was in summer 2020. But when people come through an illness like cancer, for example, and then they're in remission and they have a clean bill of health from the doctor, they often say, "I beat cancer," or people look at them and say, "You beat cancer. You're such a badass," or whatever. And the reality is that that none of us choose the time. Well, I guess some of us try to choose, but none of us really can choose the time and place of our own death.
True.
And there are plenty of people who fought valiantly. I think especially my mom, who fought valiantly to the very end, and still succumb to the illness or to the disease. And so, to me, I think to have beaten something doesn't necessarily mean that you've actually won, right? For example, none of us can beat or cheat death, because we all will die one day. Right. But rather, to beat something is to emerge on the other side of the battle, having lived or died, completely surrendering the outcome to Jesus Christ. And so I wish that Catholics were more cognizant of the language around that, because even the language with which you talk about those things really matters.
I think it does matter, and there's a lot of really awful language going on about COVID and the fight with COVID. And I deliberately choose the language of recovery instead of saying I beat this SOB virus. I beat it to a pulp. Or no, actually it beat me to a pulp for about a week with the heavy fatigue. But I recovered, and the recovery is because of God's grace and and also the robust economy with which He has invested our bodies. And I thank our Lord for my immune system.
No kidding.
Yeah.
It is sad to think how many people are still succumbing to COVID. I just one of my colleagues today asked for prayers for an uncle who just passed away today. So
I would offer this warning too, and I know I don't want to get too far off topic. Yeah. My next door neighbor here in Scranton, her aunt, who wasn't very old, like in her 50s, passed away suddenly from COVID, rapidly from COVID. Oh. She had COVID. She knew she had COVID, but it was apparently very mild. And then all of a sudden, she couldn't breathe. I mean, like in an instant, she couldn't breathe. And she passed out, taken to the hospital, died like 2 hours later. A friend of mine had COVID last year and was in the hospital for about 40 days.
I remember that.
And
you
exactly the same thing happened to him, where he was, okay, I'm fine. And then all of a sudden, boom, in an instant, can't breathe. Fine. So I would say, if you have COVID and you say, it's no big deal, be sure you keep track of your oxygen saturation levels, because they can drop drastically even while you feel like you're breathing normally. Mm-hmm. And then all of a sudden, you're passed out. And if you don't have anybody around you, you're dead. So COVID is nothing to trifle with.
Man. Yeah, no kidding. Well, like I said, I'm glad you recovered, and all thanks to God's grace, Larry.
Thank you.
Speaking of illness and grace, let's transition to our main topic today. This is something that you and I have been talking about for a while. Part of the delay in getting this episode out is because of the coronavirus. Part of the delay, though, is also because I think we were going to do it 2 months ago, and I was still kind of working my way through the book. So it's been on my list for a long time. I'd heard about it, and then I think I heard you, or I think I read some of your blogs that mentioned Bernanos.
I mentioned him a lot.
Yeah, and I see why. So I was like, I think I have to read this book. This would be a good thing for someone like me, who often sort of gets wrapped up in the vicissitudes of modern life and preoccupied with health and well-being and all of that. And this is a great book for someone like me. So The Diary of a Country Priest is written by George Bernanos, who is a French writer. It was written in 1936. There's a 1951 film by the same name, but it is set in a small little town in northern France. Town might even be overstating it. It's a rural area.
Ambicourt.
So most of Ambicourt, exactly. Though your pronunciation was better than mine. So
it's Ambicourt.
The American pronunciation is Ambricourt, I believe. So it's set in that town in northern France, and there's this very new, very young country priest, and his first pastoral assignment or parochial assignment is to be the country priest for Ambricourt, and he does this, and the whole novel. There's only the very end, I think, actually breaks character, where it's not actually from the pages of his diary. The rest of the novel is all from his diary as he's working through the challenges of being a country priest. And there are a lot of them. There are health challenges, which become more significant as the book goes on. There are problems of catechesis with his first communion students that he's teaching in Sunday school and faith formation. There are problems with juggling the sort of needs and requests and desires of the very wealthy patrons in Ambricourt. It's an area with a lot of inequality. So there's basically the landed, former noble families, and then there are rural agricultural farm owning peasants, and so he has to sort of juggle those dynamics as well. And it's a really, really good read. So that's my quick summary of the plot. But Larry, do you have any sort of opening comments before we sort of dive into dissecting what's going on in this book?
No, it's just to add on to the fact that about Bernanos, the author, who at least for quite a while in his life was a monarchist politically, a royalist, as they would say, and a bit of an agitator for that, and a political activist for that. And the reason why I bring that up is to highlight the fact that Bernanos really, he did not have warm feelings towards the modern world. Like so many Catholic intellectuals in the middle part of the 20th century, they were very disaffected by the modern world and found it to be cold, technocratic, already then technocratic, bureaucratic, managerial, and they felt like it crushed the soul. In this way, he's very much like a figure like Péguy, Claudel, Francois Mauriac, and others in that French vein of thinking. Just read Bernanos' little book, The Great Cemeteries Under the Moon, which is his account of the Spanish Civil War. And it's just damning towards... Now, he wasn't, in a sense, a Luddite, anti-technology, all that. But he had... and my point is, he did have this longing for a more classical culture, let's put it that way, with the fusing together of Catholicism and culture and politics into one seamless society, Catholic France. And he had a wistful, almost nostalgic longing for that. And I think that comes through in Diary of a Country Priest as well.
Yeah, it certainly does. And you're right. I think there's something fascinating about the interwar period, and then following World War II, the post-war period, where we see a sort of effort to remake society in accordance with this bureaucratic, technocratic, empiricist vision. When I was at Oxford, I did my master's thesis on a similar idea, which was that basically in the post-war era, after two world wars caused the death of tens of millions of people, there was an effort at the highest levels of political power. There was an effort to make sure that this never happened again. And the thinking was, if we can identify exactly all of the sort of technical causes of human conflict and war, then we can make sure that we eliminate those causes. Yep. And so there was a move away from this anthropocentric or this anthropological vision for what generates human conflict and how society should look, and instead a move towards this very sort of technocratic, bureaucratic, empiricist way. This is obviously where the birth of the social sciences come in. It's no longer.
Oh yeah.
It's politics is no longer a political theory. it is now political science, right? And
Yeah,
so
it's all part of the onward march of the empiricism of the natural world and its ever increasing subjugation to the hegemony of the hard sciences, to such an extent that eventually the hard sciences extend themselves to the human being and to human society as well. So now everything has to come under the aegis of some hard science, and eventually it's political science, it's sociology, it's psychology. Also come to be viewed as these kinds of sciences. And this is exactly the kind of thing that Bernanos was appalled by, this managerial society. I mean, C.S. Lewis wrote about it, in The Abolition of Man, his famous little book about eventually there's going to be the controlled and the controllers. And Bernanos very much had that same vision. I mean, Tolkien was inspired after World War I by this same negative vision, which runs throughout Lord of the Rings, which is really, I mean, all of it is kind of a riff on Gerard Manley Hopkins' poem, right? God's Grandeur, where Hopkins says that everything in the world now wears man's smudge. We've smeared everything. We've smudged everything. But still, as Hopkins says, there's a freshness that still lives deep down things. And it's that freshness that Bernanos and others, Peggy, Tolkien, because they're Catholics, they still seek that freshness in sanctity. And this is what comes out in Diary of a Country Priest. Its main theme is sanctity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. On your point about the smudge in the Hopkins poem, the smudge is there, but the interesting thing is we sometimes smudge things just because we're trying to mess them up. But more often it's because we're trying to make them better. We're trying to sort of leave our mark and improve things. And it kind of reminds me, as a father, it reminds me of, I've been doing some painting around the house as we get ready to sell it. And that's why, by the way, I told you, Larry, but not my listeners, the backdrop looks a little bit different, and my bookshelf is shorn of most of its contents, et cetera, because we're getting ready to move. But so I've been painting a little bit, right? And if my son comes along and says, I'll help you, Daddy, and then picks up like the wrong color paintbrush, right, and just smears it on there, he's trying to make it better. But he doesn't, right? He leaves a mark that despite his best intentions, he's messing it up. So I think we are often guilty of the same.
I'm guilty of that when I clean my glasses. I end up just smudging them. It's like, they're not clean; they're smudged. Yeah. So I think it's a good point you just made. Yeah.
Yeah. So back to the book. Like you said, the whole point of the book is sanctity, and I didn't really talk about the sort of I guess the climax of the book at the very end. So spoiler alert, if you want to read the book and you don't want this spoiled, it was spoiled for me before I read the book, so I knew it was coming. So spoiler, here it is. Throughout the book, this young priest faces some serious stomach ailments. And at first, it just seems like sort of typical indigestion, and he deals with it various ways. His diet becomes strangely restricted, so that basically all he can have is which is interesting, bread and wine, right? And there's obviously some symbolism there. But then he ends up at the very end of the book, he ends up seeing a specialist. And the specialist initially dismisses him and tells him he's fine. And then the specialist comes back to him and basically says, I wasn't being straight with you. The specialist ends up having terminal cancer, but then also says, you have stomach cancer, I'm pretty sure. And that's the diagnosis that this young priest ends up leaving with. He doesn't even get a chance to return to his parochial assignment. In that town, he's staying with a friend. The friend himself is a former priest or former seminarian. I actually don't exactly remember, but now he's pursuing married life. But anyway, this priest dies, essentially in his friend's arms in the middle of the night. And the last words on this priest's lips, as recorded by his friend later on to the ecclesiastical authorities, is "Doesn't matter, grace is everywhere." And so this priest has just fought and fought valiantly. I mean, I think he was really trying to do his best in his humble assignment, but he was really just having a lot of troubles in that humble priestly assignment in Ambricourt. And at the end, he finally acknowledges that the grace was there all the while. I think he was spending so much time agonizing over whether or not he's being a good enough priest, about whether or not he's pastoring his people well, about whether or not he's really giving to God all that he should. And then he finally comes to realize at the end, in a very sort of Thérèse of Lisieux fashion, that grace is everywhere. And I think that's to me the best part of the book, probably to most people as well. But it's
related to that is actually that there is an alternate translation of the last line that is
I've seen this. Yeah, yeah.
most often translated grace is everywhere. And I remember once I wrote a research paper for a doctoral level course I was taking at Fordham during my doctoral studies. And I wrote it for a professor who was a native French speaker. And I quoted that, grace is everywhere. And when I got the paper back, it was graded well, but he said essentially, no, grace is all. Tout.
Yes.
And there are French speakers that would disagree with him, but he talked to me later, and he said, well, the reason why he preferred grace is all as the last line of the book is precisely kind of for the point that you were making, where the young priest realizes that everything he has endured, everything is grace. That he was thinking in terms of means to ends and what the goals he wanted to achieve in his parish, the things he had to do, what he wanted to accomplish. And he would view his illness and his various shortcomings in his skill set and intellect as impediments to all of that. And yet at the end he realizes, no. All is grace. All, which is a different, simply way of saying, grace is everywhere. It's in all things. Right. But I kind of prefer almost the grace is all translation, even if it's not quite as literal as the grace is everywhere translation. And I can have some justification in that since a French speaker told me that. I think. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say I was only recently made aware of that alternate translation. In fact, the Wikipedia page for Diary of a Country Priest says all is grace rather than grace is everywhere.
Yeah.
I just wonder if the translator trying to sort of translate for a vernacular American English audience.
No. I just wrote an article for Communio, International Catholic Review, and it's in its galley proofs right now, PDF form in there. They're going to publish it in the next issue. It's on kind of the stuff I blog about, but I quoted Diary of a Country Priest, and I translated that verse, "Grace is all." But one of the editors, who is not a native French speaker but fluent in French and quite a scholar, changed the translation back to "Grace is everything," and said, "No. I understand that it's kind of popular now to say grace is all, but it means grace is everything. Grace is everywhere. Grace is everywhere. I'm sorry." So I read French,
this is though. I've been sort of immersed in this world a little bit. In my day job, as you know, Larry's doing some sort of I'm not doing the translation work, but I'm sort of doing some management of translation projects. And one of the challenges is that in a language, this is a great example. In a language like French, you can have a word that is sort of ambiguous, and there's beauty in the ambiguity because it can be interpreted either way, right? So you can have native French speakers and readers who read that, and the connotation is somewhere between all or everywhere, right? And that's probably what Bernanos intended, right?
Yeah, I think so.
It's hard that we have to settle on one.
And they're both beautiful, so maybe we're splitting hairs for no reason here. We're getting maybe too arcane and splitting fine hairs over a French word, because it does kind of boil down to the same thing. Right. That grace is in all things, and including everything that he's experienced. But that's your favorite line, eh? My favorite part of the book is actually on the complete opposite end of the book, the very first page, where if you've read my blog, you know that I'm very fond of quoting the young priest in his diary, where he says, "My parish is bored, like all parishes are bored."
Yes.
And he goes on to describe that boredom, and then at the end he says, "And there's not a thing we can do about it." And I think that line summarizes very nicely Bernanos' sense of futility with regard to salvaging anything from bourgeois modernity as a vehicle, as a vessel for promoting the Catholic faith. I think he really viewed bourgeois modernity, the managerial state, what Berdyaev called the culture of well-being, material well-being. Mm-hmm. That's what I mean by bourgeois modernity, the modern world that orients itself around material security, material comfort. I mean, just think about it for a second. Half of our income goes towards this strange thing called insurance, an unheard of phenomena in the history of the world. Yeah. But not that insurance is a bad thing, but you get my point. And so Bernanos is saying right here on the opening pages There is something that afflicts the modern Catholic faith and is killing it, is toxic, is poisonous. And what afflicts it is the acedia of modern spiritual boredom. And there's no way around it by simply trying to double down on modernity. You have to look for answers elsewhere. And the church isn't. And this is what comes out in that other book, Great Cemeteries Under the Moon. He has a fictional agnostic give a speech in front of a bunch of prelates in the cathedral. And the fictional agnostic says essentially this, that you guys have all doubled down on modernity. You've made your accommodations, you've made your compromises, and you're fools for doing so, because all you've done is to sign your death warrant. You've got an illness and you keep popping arsenic, thinking it's going to cure me. And so Bernanos, right at the beginning, diagnoses the spiritual malaise of our time, spiritual boredom, and it's not just I'm tired of church. It's a deep existential disinterestedness in anything as having any ultimate value, where everything loses its flavor. So anyway, that's my favorite line. My parish is bored. And it's always raining, notice.
Yes, it is.
In the very
For
beginning, too, he says it's raining all the time, and it's like kind of a rain that seeps into your bones.
Yeah.
And
he says, I'm gonna read a little bit of this from the first page. He starts out, like you said, mine is a parish like all the rest. They're all alike. Those of today, I mean, right? So he's saying this is a sort of unique. This is a uniquely modern affliction. And then he says in the next paragraph, my parish is bored stiff. No other word for it. Like so many others, we can see them being eaten up by boredom, and we can't do anything about it. Someday, perhaps, we shall catch it ourselves, become aware of the cancerous growth within us. You can keep going a long time with that in you, which is, of course, a foreshadowing.
But foreshadowing.
What is growing inside him.
Yeah.
And then this thought struck me yesterday on my rounds. It was drizzling, the kind of thin, steady rain which gets sucked in with every breath, which seeps down through the lungs into your belly. I mean, it's such good writing. It's absolutely amazing.
Yeah. No,
go ahead.
So, there's a picture that is painted for you right from the beginning. A bored parish in a dreary, rainy landscape. It's just not good. It's dour. It's a downer beginning. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah, it is. I can see why that's your favorite line, Larry, because I think it's that animating idea.
Yes.
From which you find, with which you find the common touch point in a lot of your writing for today, because it applies today, maybe even more than it did.
Yeah, because my personal motto in life has got to be, it's worse than you think it is. So anything that begins like that is going to catch my attention immediately. I'm a glass half empty kind of guy, so just your viewers should know that.
Yeah. I think it's good, though, because, I think it is often worse than we think it is. And I think about this a lot. We all should, about how the powers of hell are active and out there and prowling around the world seeking the ruin of souls. That's attested to by Scripture. And this is not only a material world in which we inhabit. This is a supernatural world, first and foremost. And then after that is a natural world. The supernatural precedes the natural in the order of being, and so we are not engaged in a battle of flesh and blood, and so I think it is worse than we think it is, because what we often think it is based on the material evidence that we see,
right.
Sometimes the emotions that we feel. Neither of those things capture the entirety of what.
When you think about it, and Bernanos writes about this, that it's the old, you can boil a frog kind of thing, where if you put the frog in tepid water, it won't jump out, and gradually increase the heat. And the frog will literally boil to death and won't jump out. I've heard that story, as we all have, for decades. I've never experimented to figure out if it's actually true or just an apocryphal pile of nonsense.
Right.
But it's repeated so often by so many people, because it is an apt analogy for the sociology and psychology of how human beings can allow themselves to fall into desperate situations culturally. And you think, like the Germans right before World War II, whatever, could they not see where all of this was headed? No, actually, they couldn't see, because through a slow incremental process of drip, 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 slow change, it's amazing how the ordinariness, the quotidian nature of day-to-day living works on our psychology in a way that anesthetizes us to evil. I mean, this is why Hannah Arendt had that famous line about the banality of evil. This is kind of what she meant, the ordinariness of it, the everydayness of it after a while. How can a German who was simply a kindly banker, who gave candy to little kids on the street and was nice to his neighbor and his mama, how could that then all of a sudden he's killing Jews in a gas chamber? Through that process of the banalization of evil. And this is one of Bernanos' concerns here. The church needs to wake up. This is like the fictional thing from the agnostic, but it shows up in Diary of a Country Priest as well. Here you have this very holy priest. He doesn't know he's holy, but he is. And he's out here, he's trying to get people, all right, to come to God, to live lives oriented around God. And yet the resistances he faces from his catechism kids, from some of his fellow priests, from the rest of his parishioners, from the rich countess and her family. Mm-hmm. All right. And they resist because they're infected with the bacillus of modern bourgeois modernity. And so they, through a series of incremental small steps, have lost the sense of God. As Joseph Ratzinger and Pope Benedict said, the thing that afflicts the modern world is the eclipse of our sense of God. This is what Bernanos is driving at here. And that's why he wants to be how bored his parish is and how the everydayness of everything is just crushing his parish. This is clearly a theme that just screams out from the pages of this book.
Yeah, and you could argue the climax is his death. You could also argue that that's more of a coda, and actually it probably is more accurate to say that's a coda. I think the climax of the book may be his conversation with the Countess.
In the center of the book. It is.
Yeah.
You're absolutely correct that the death scene is a coda. I will add one more thing to what I just said, though, about all the people in the book that resist him. Notice here, in some sense, the most compassionate person in the whole book is the ex-priest at the very end. Yes. Who shows the young curé some compassion that he had not gotten from anybody else. And in some ways, I think this is Bernanos' way of saying that holiness can be found not simply in the channelized ways that we often like to think it is. It can be found, grace is everywhere. It can be found everywhere.
Yeah.
But
totally
you're right.
agree.
The high point is his conversation with the Countess.
Yeah. Yeah, and I was thinking about that because he mentions evil and he's sort of arguing with her about the existence of God and whether or not God is real, and then arguing with her about evil. And he has this amazing conversation with her in which he's talking about all of these various topics. I'm looking at my my digital copy of the book right now. This is in his diary. This immediately precedes his conversation with the Countess. But he's talking about evil, and he says, many souls, yes, many more than we dare imagine, souls apparently quite indifferent to any religion. There's the spiritual boredom or indifferentism you're talking about, Larry. Any morality even, must at last on one day out of all their days have come to suspect, an instant will do it, something of this satanic possession, and long to escape it no matter how. Solidarity in evil, there is the horror of it. And he goes on to say, the world of evil is so far beyond our understanding, nor can I really succeed in picturing hell as a world, a universe. It is nothing, never will be anything but a half-formed shape, the hideous shape of an abortion, a stunted thing on the very verge of all existence. And then, this is maybe the most sort of haunting, we are told that the Earth is still quite young after thousands of centuries, still as it were in the pristine stages of its planetary evolution. Evil, too, is only at its beginning. God, I presumed upon my strength. You cast me off into despair as we fling a scarce-born animal into the water, tiny and blind. And then basically right after these reflections in his diary, he goes on to talk to the Countess.
Somewhere in there he talks, too, about how just as there's the communion of saints, there's the communion of evil.
Yes, he does. Let me see if I can find it.
It's a kind of solidarity of evil as well, but it's a kind of simulacrum of the communion of saints, a parody of it, a counterfeit.
Yeah.
But your listeners should know that the reason why the Countess does not believe in God and is bitter towards God is, she lost her son, killed, died when a baby, and so she never kind of got over that.
I found the line, by the way. Yeah, she didn't. But the beautiful thing about that whole conversation with her is that it ends with a confession, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And so he, through his persistence, opens the door to sacramental grace for her. But here's the line, Larry. This is right in that same section, just before the excerpt I read. There is not only a communion of saints, there is also a communion of sinners. In their hatred of one another, their contempt, sinners unite, embrace, intermingle, become as one. One day in the eyes of eternal God, they will be no more than a mass of perpetual slime over which the vast tide of divine love, that sea of living, roaring flame which gave birth to all things, passes vainly.
And that's something.
It's pretty powerful.
Powerful
pretty
stuff.
Powerful language.
You know, the French intellectual just died a few years ago, René Girard, would have a lot to say about that communion of sinners. He's a very interesting figure that I think mirrors here what Bernanos is saying, where Girard points out that the origins of almost all human violence and all human sinfulness is what he calls mimetic desire, or, imitative desire. That it's not just that we desire things, but we start to desire what we see others desiring. So that's called mimetic or imitating desire. And when we start desiring what others desire, then there's a competition. It's a little bit Hobbesian, but in a different register. And I think this is kind of what Bernanos is hinting at here, too. There's a jealousy amongst sinners. There's a competition among sinners. And so they're all sort of desiring the same things, but they can't all have it. And so they're fighting each other over it. It's a very degraded sense of what the goods of human life are, about what freedom is all about. And Bernanos is just great on this stuff.
Yeah, he is. I like your point about Girard and the mimetic desire. I hadn't thought about it in that way, but I think that's a profound way of.
Well, it's on my mind because I'm reading about it lately. So, I got to drag you into these conversations, whatever it is I'm reading about lately.
It's good. Are you writing something on it?
Yeah, eventually I'm going to be giving a paper next fall at St. Patrick's Seminary in San Francisco on Girard. And Balthazar was very
cool.
fond of Girard, too.
Was he really?
Yeah.
I guess that's not terribly surprising. Yeah.
I can't remember where. Somewhere in the trilogy, he spends about 5 pages on Girard and said, this guy's onto something. Okay. I mean, the criticism of Girard is that he's a one-trick pony. Once you get away from his basic idea about mimetic desire, not much there. But that's not true. He's actually a very profound thinker. But anyway, back to Bernanos and Diary of a Country Priest.
Yeah. Yeah, so back to this conversation with the Countess as well, because I think this is maybe a good sort of one to dissect a little bit. So as you mentioned, she is a very bitter woman because of the death of her son. Was it a suicide? I'm trying to remember now.
No, it wasn't. I don't think so.
Was it an illness?
Yeah, I think it's an illness. Yeah.
Either way, her son is taken far too young from her, and she blames God for it. So she's become sort of a I think she'd probably fall into the category of practical atheism, Larry.
I think so, and
she confesses a belief in God, but when she's honest with herself and with the curé, the priest, she also asks all the questions that sort of indicate her lack of belief in God, and she certainly behaves as if God does not exist, which is the hallmark of practical atheism.
And her husband's an adulterer, and her daughter's a piece of work. her life is just what we'd call a hot mess. And it goes to show that the point being in Bernanos in the novel here, that despite her high social standing and her financial stability, she's as spiritually miserable as the most miserable person on the planet.
Yeah, and I think this is certainly one of the insights of the novel. This country priest has very little money. That is mentioned several times in his diary. Most of the people whom he pastors have very little money because it's a rural population. The Countess and her husband are very well-to-do. But in that conversation, he says, where she's basically saying, I can see these things because I'm rich and well-to-do. He says, do you really think the poor are deaf and blind? Unluckily, they're far too sharp-sighted. Madam, the most stupidly blind of all people are the satisfied rich. You can hide vice away in your houses, but poor men smell it out from afar. We're told so much about pagan vices, but at least pagan slaves had only to submit like animals, and once a year their pagan masters smiled at the Saturnalia. Whereas you abuse the word of God, which teaches the poor to obey in their hearts. You fancy you can steal by cunning what you ought to take on your bended knees as a gift from on high. There's no greater danger in the world than rich men's hypocrisy.
Oh yeah, and
She doesn't love that.
no, and it also shows. I mean, one of the criticisms that I have read of the novel is that for a simple little cure, a simple little, fairly unintellectual little pastor of a parish, he strangely sounds like Bernanos giving a lecture once in a while. You know, and this is perhaps one of those instances where all of a sudden he sounds like Bernanos sermonizing. But I don't think that's a fair criticism. That's a criticism I've read more than once of the novel, that the cure is just a mouthpiece for some of Bernanos' pet ideas. I don't think that's true. I think Bernanos is actually making a very serious point here, which is that this young cure doesn't have tutored education. What he has is wisdom, and it's a wisdom born of sanctity. And even though he's uneducated, he's not inarticulate. He's a very articulate man, and he's a very intelligent man, even though he's not, like you said, really super educated. And it is his sanctity which gives him insight and wisdom, and then the ability, like a spiritual surgeon, to dissect this woman's psyche, her soul, for her, in order to lay out for her how she should move forward, how she can get over this spiritual malaise that she is in. So he's actually painting a very, very astute picture of holiness here.
Yeah, and so on that point, that did occur to me a few times where I'm reading this dialogue, for example, between him and the Countess, and he has these beautifully almost diagrammed paragraphs where he's making a profound point.
Remember, though, too, before I let you go on, he is, after all, these are actual quotes from a diary. I mean, this is then the priest writing in his diary.
Yes. That's exactly what I was going to say,
okay.
right? Because I would think, this seems a little bit smooth for him to have delivered at the moment. And then I thought, this is his own recounting of the conversation, right? So then I sort of picture him delivering this to the Countess, and he might be stuttering. There might be times where he's sort of less sure of himself. It doesn't mean that he has that he's delivering it less forcefully, but it's probably not delivered quite as smoothly as he recounts in the diary, right?
Right, and he might then also be conflating all kinds of things that he said in disparate moments during the conversation.
Right.
But he just cuts out all the fluff and condenses it all into a paragraph. Here's what I said to her. It might have taken me half an hour to say this, but here's essentially what I said to her.
It was there. It was all there.
Yeah.
So I think the other insight here, in addition to that, I think it's not Bernanos. This is a holy priest who's able to diagnose the same thing as that Bernanos diagnosed. In addition to that, I think this sort of puts to lie the notion that we can't simultaneously be concerned with spiritual rot and also be proclaiming the love of God.
Oh yeah.
Because this priest throughout the book is constantly proclaiming the love of God. His dying proclamation obviously is grace is everywhere, or all is grace, depending on the translation. And even in his conversation with the Countess, he reminds her both of God's love, but also of the importance of firmness and of spiritual firmness and of not being spiritually apathetic. I'm looking.
Yeah, he can be quite tough with her.
Totally, yeah. I mean, I'm looking at this part where she says, "Hold your tongue." He's basically reminding her about the spiritual consequences of hardness of heart, and those spiritual consequences are hate and separation from God. And she says, "Hold your tongue." He says, "No, madam, too many priests have held their tongues, and I wish it had only been from pity. But we're cowards. We let you talk once we've established a principle. And what have you laymen made of hell? A kind of penal servitude for eternity on the lines of your convict prisons on earth, to which you condemn in advance all the wretched felons your police have hunted from the beginning, enemies of society, as you call them. You're kind enough to include the blasphemers and the profane. What proud or reasonable man could stomach such a notion of God's justice? And when you find that notion inconvenient, it's easy enough for you to put it on one side. Hell is judged by the standards of the world, and hell is not of this world. It is of the other world, and still less of this Christian society." And he goes on a little bit more, and then he says, "Hell is not to love anymore, madam, not to love anymore. That sounds quite ordinary to you. To a human being still alive, it means to love less or love elsewhere. To understand is still a way of loving. But suppose this faculty which seems so inseparably ours, of our very essence, should disappear. O prodigy, to stop loving, to stop understanding, and yet to live." And so I like in there the two things, right? He's being super firm with her. He is not letting her get away with her sort of bourgeois Catholicism or her practical atheism. And yet he's also reminding her of the love of God and how that
mercy.
Is the
God's
standard
mercy.
by which. Yeah.
And what he's pointing out to her is a phrase that I like to use, which is that he's criticizing what is kind of a form of contractual Catholicism, as I call it, contractual, where you're not bargaining with God, you're sort of bargaining with God indirectly through the church. And so the church has these moral rules and these sacramental disciplines. And so you sort of make a pact that I'm going to live according to these rules. And when I occasionally fail them, then I do the rule that the church says I have to do, is I go to this confession box thing. And then I, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, I did these things. Okay, you're out of here. And this is contractual Catholicism. It never goes deep. And it's never dwelt on the love of God. It really is, therefore, true that the less Catholic you are, the more judgmental you are. This is Bernanos' point. The more lukewarm Catholic you are, the more you're going to be the one separating sinners from the non-sinners and wagging your finger, because that's all you have. All you have at that point is judging in a kind of contractual, penal concept of things. Yeah. But that's why I think the figure of the ex-priest at the end is so very important, because he's an example of non-contractual Catholicism. He clearly still has some sort of union with the church, some sort of communion with the church, however estranged it might be. But his Catholicism is not contractual. He understands the love of God. He understands that hell is not to love anymore. And so all of these scenes are connected. But this scene with the Countess is absolutely the central part of the book.
Yeah,
because it's his breakthrough moment. I mean, he succeeds.
Right. Yes. Yes, exactly. And I think that is interesting, because he doesn't know if he totally succeeds, right? I mean, he
thinks he fails.
There's the confession.
Yeah,
exactly. And so I think that's beautiful as well, because he thinks he fails, at least partly.
Partly fails. Yeah,
the smashing success.
Yeah, he questions it and so forth. Yeah.
Right, and then she dies. Right.
Yeah.
So he goes to his grave.
It's not funny, but
yeah.
Like,
well, it is. I mean, it's funny in the sense that, like, there's a humor there in that God's ways are so much higher than ours. The insight here from Bernanos is that that success is not ours to know.
Right.
Success is not ours to judge.
Yeah.
And so what the priest is he's faithful in confronting the Countess. He's faithful in essentially preaching to her. There's the confession, but he's still not convinced he totally succeeded. And then she dies, and then of course he's sort of racked with guilt for her death and wondering if
people blame him.
He caused that.
People in the book they blame him for it.
Yeah, and his ecclesiastical superiors say, you have to tell us what you talked about.
Yeah,
she died after that.
Yeah, what did you do to this poor? How did you torture her psychologically?
Must have been really bad.
Yeah,
and he basically says, like, what was said was between her and me.
Oh yeah.
And so it wasn't what was said was not in a sacramental confession. So it's not bound by a seal in that sense. Not bound by
in modern France, that might not even matter anymore.
Because my goodness,
they're struggling with that right now. Anyway, that's a completely different topic.
I didn't realize that. I haven't seen that in the news. That's
the French government has now, like the Australians, has mandated that if you find out about
certain crimes,
if you find out about child sex abuse in the confessional, you have to report it. Either if it's the abuser confessing or the young child that's been abused confessing.
Yep.
You have to report it to the authorities. And a French bishop said, well, you can't break the seal of the confessional. And everybody condemned him in the French government, saying, hey, look, the laws of the Republic are higher than your silly little church laws. And, of course, they've now armed with this document that shows 70 years of episcopal malfeasance on the issue of child abuse. So the bishops have no credibility. And they've shot themselves in the foot, as my friend Adam DeVille points out. The bishops have no one to blame here but themselves. But still, it doesn't change the fact that the seal of the confessional is being compromised. Now, this is not off topic. This is kind of, it is in France, but it's Bernanos' point that sooner or later, if you accommodate yourself to bourgeois modernity and the, in a sense, authority of the managerial liberal state, you are eventually simply going to become an adjunct to that,
Yeah.
to the Ministry of Justice or the Ministry of Culture. You're just an appendage to the authority of the government. And Bernanos was waving that red flag decades and decades ago, and now here the chickens are coming home to roost. There you go. Nobody goes to church in France anymore, other than maybe 5% of Catholics, and the church is riddled with scandal and corruption, and all of it is the result of exactly what Bernanos was identifying in this novel. In Diary of a Country Priest, 60 years ago, he was saying, we're in for a world of hurt if we don't properly diagnose the spiritual disease that is afflicting us, and that the only antidote to that disease isn't a synod or some sort of
What about a synod on synods?
A synod on synods or some sort of marketing strategy. No, it's holiness. It's sanctity. And that sounds cliche. That sounds like, we just need to be holier and everything. Well, it's true. The church exists for no other reason than to bring people to Christ and his holiness. There is no other reason to be a Catholic than to desire to be a saint. And that is Bernanos' point throughout this thing. The cure is a model for us all, not just for other priests, is a model for us all. I reread that book every single year at some point as a spiritual exercise to remind myself that sanctity and holiness are the answer, the only answer to the problems that afflict us, the only possible answer. And it's always been the case that it is the only possible answer. The church always, always, always gets into trouble when it forgets that and starts to make deals, deal or no deal. Okay, let's make a deal. The church is always dealing, and it always falls flat on its face because guess what? The church is lousy at deals. So is Trump, by the way, but he likes to think he's good at deals. But the church is really bad at deals.
That's all well said. I think it's a good note to end on, Larry. We, what do you know? We came full circle and we ended on the call to holiness and the importance of personal sanctity, which is what we always.
That's why I love this book. It's what it's about.
Yeah,
it's what it's about.
This is it's become a major theme in my podcast since in my conversations with you, I've sort of realized the importance of that, and so you've inspired me to sort of make that a theme of my other podcasts as well. So they always come back to personal sanctity and the universal call to holiness. I think, to your point about how that's cliche, right? The answer is holiness. To an audience of practical atheists or an audience of actual atheists or an audience of agnostics even, or just those who sort of don't believe in the transformative power of Christ and reject the theological consequences of the incarnation, to that audience, it does sound cliche because what it sounds like we're saying is like we have to be nicer to people. We have to just be
it's nice to be nice to the nice.
Yeah. We have to just focus on being better people all around, and then we won't have these problems.
I'd rather laugh with the sinners than cry with the saints. You guys are all so dour.
Right.
But this is why novels like this are so good. Because, one of the reasons why it sounds cliche to say holiness is that it's disembodied. Yeah. What do you mean, holiness? Is this holy card piety, lighting candles at church? What is this? Yeah. Whereas you read some of these, I know we're out of time, but there's another little short story novelette by Bernanos that I actually like better than Diary of a Country Priest.
Oh, wow.
It's called Mouchette. And it's about a young girl, and it's spoiler alert, she so don't listen any further if you don't want to. She ends up killing herself. So you'd think she's not a supreme model of sanctity, and in some ways Bernanos is not presenting her as an ideal model of sanctity, but she's a young girl who goes through all kinds of nonsense in her life. Very poor peasant French girl. And like I said, it's a very short story, maybe 50, 60 pages. That's it. It's an easy read. But it's I remember the first time I read it, I was so invested in her character. I was crushed. I cried when I got to the end and realized that she killed herself. And like I said, spoiler alert for your readers now, but I would highly recommend people to read this because just like with the ex-priest at the end of Diary of a Country Priest, so too with Mouchette. What Bernanos is keen to show, as many of the French novelists of that time were, is that holiness does not necessarily fit into a preconceived mold. He wasn't questioning the church's moral teaching or her spiritual laws, but he was pointing out grace is everywhere. And we have to be very astute to seeing where sanctity raises its head.
And I think that's the point, right? Holiness means nothing without grace, because holiness without grace is not actually holiness. It's right. It's just attempts at personal rectitude. It's us leaning on ourselves to try to do good things and be nice to people. But grace is the difference maker there. And so when we talk about holiness and holiness as the solution out of the church's problems, what we're talking about is the radical or the encounter of the human soul with the radical grace of Jesus Christ and the transformative power
absolutely
that offers. And that's what I see in A Diary of a Country Priest. And it's not only in the curé, the priest who's the main character. It's primarily through him, and he's obviously the lens through which the book is written. But it's also through the Countess. It's in that sort of encounter with grace that she has when she falls to her knees and confesses.
She's a model of conversion, of penitence, of repentance.
Yeah, exactly.
And there's sanctity in that.
Right.
There's sanctity in the ex-priest. There's sanctity in the curé. There's sanctity in the Countess.
Yep. There's also the peasant girl who trudges to church every day and is not treated well by her father, but she wants to be there. And she's
kind of like Mouchette, who wears her wooden shoes and trudges to and from school in the rain. It's always in the rain with Bernanos.
Yes, always in the rain. Yep. Or the snow in some scenes in Diary. But the point is, like, the elements are just beating us down, right? But they're forging us. There's grace in the elements. They're forging our sanctity and our holiness. So, well, I think this is a great note to end on, Larry. Thanks so much for coming on and doing a discussion of this book. This is long overdue, but I'm really glad we did it. And thanks for introducing me to the book, because it's I think it's rare. It's definitely 2 thumbs up. It's rare that you read a book that really is life changing in the sense that it can just change the whole way you see the world.
Changed my life.
I think this is one of those books for me. So. Grace is everywhere, or grace is all. It's a great note to end on. So thanks so much, Larry. To my listeners, Larry will be back. He does the monthly show with me when he's not recovering from COVID. So he'll be back. But if you have any questions for him in the meantime, feel free to send me a note. Zach, Z-A-C, @creedalpodcast.com. If you have any questions or comments on the show in general, feel free to send me a note. Zach, Z-A-C, @creedalpodcast.com. Larry, thank you so much for joining once again.
Thank you so much for having me, Zach. It's always great.
I totally agree. And I'll look forward to our next discussion. To our listeners, God bless you.